families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Families Divided TV. While we know targeted parents can't independently stop parental alienation, this episode focuses on building empathy for targeted parents while increasing their resiliency. Targeted parents are often faced with unnerving and unsolvable dilemmas. While they seek to resolve them, confounding stress builds. Most average to above average range parents can suffer exasperation, panic, and desperation. In Randy Flood's work with targeted parents, he's often witnessed rejected parents being tragically seduced into making mistakes while they are in the throes of the 5 common dilemmas. These mistakes can occur with children, co-parents, and mental health and legal professionals. By explaining the 5 common dilemmas targeted parents often find themselves in, viewers will better understand how targeted parents can get seduced into making the common mistakes. Viewers in this episode will better understand targeted parents and be better positioned to strategically intervene and enable targeted parents to be more keen, nimble, and resilient when interacting and coping with alienated children and the mental health and legal professionals they encounter. We're really excited about this episode. This is really a good one. We also want to let you know that we are almost to the end of registration time for our upcoming fall conference, Alienation, the Truth regarding the trauma and the abuse. This is going to be on October 13th through the 15th. It is virtual. It is international. You have until October the 8th to register. That is your deadline. So you want to get registered now. We have things planned through the whole 2.5 days, many activities, awesome presentations. We are so excited about our presenters and their topics. We're going to really hit hard on the truth in the scientific world of alienation. And we're going to give you information on how to cope with this horrible, abusive situation. So you don't want to miss this at all. I do hope you'll join us. We are going to hear today from Dr. Edward Crook. He actually is our keynote speaker. He will be presenting on Friday night. That will be live Friday night, where he's going to be inviting those who want to ask questions after his topic on the controversies that we are having. And then he's going to open the floor. I do hope some of you that really don't believe alienation and what it entails will be there. I wish you would, and I wish you would come and ask questions. This is so important for you to understand. And I really hope you'll take advantage of this opportunity from Dr. Edward Crook. He absolutely is phenomenal in his work and what he does. So please do so. We're looking forward to this event, and many have registered. We're very excited. So we're going to come back in just a little bit with Randy Flood and Dr. Edward Crook right after these messages.
Divorce and co-parenting are a major life interruption for families, especially the kids, but also for parents and grandparents. And it's even worse in blame-filled, high-conflict cases. When parents engage in alienation by turning the kids against the other parent or grandparents, kids suffer. They're denied the opportunity to build the 4 big skills necessary for future resilience. New Ways for Families online class can help. parents learn to use our popular biff and ear skills to calm the conflict and stop the hostile emails and texts. And we even have a class for kids and parents to learn together. Research shows a 75% improvement in joint parental decision-making after this course is taken, plus overall improvements for kids' well-being. Don't wait to make this affordable investment in your children's future and improve your well-being too. Start learning new ways for your family today at conflictplaybook.com.
Sadly, too many know the pain and trauma associated with parental and grandparent alienation. Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, will present an important international virtual conference on October the 13th through the 15th, 2023. The conference, entitled Alienation, The Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse, will feature world-renowned experts in the field of alienation. You'll join the conference event coordinator, Elaine Cobb, and moderator, Megan Hunter, as they introduce you to keynote speaker, Dr. Edward Crook. Plus, you'll hear important presentations from Dr. Joshua Coleman, Lisa Rothfuss, Dr. Mary Alvarez, Chris Smith, Bill Eddy, Dr. Noel Hunter, Dr. Sue Kornblum, Dr. William Burnett, Megan Hunter, and Jordan Traeger. Join the many attendees already securing their spot for the conference entitled Alienation, The Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse. For information, visit familyaccess.info for all the details. This special conference is being hosted by Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, Steel Partners Foundation, and PASCA. Parental alienation is child abuse.
Well, it's good to be back with you folks again today. I'm Randy Flood, forensic psychologist, consultant, and coach. And I spoke with you earlier about things that affect rejected parents. And I wanted to say that I've gotten my information from you, all you rejected, targeted parents of parental alienation. It's just not stuff I've come up on my own. It's from the years of doing clinical work since 1992, doing parenting coordination, doing forensic evaluations of families when resist and refuse dynamics are present, and doing parent-child reunification counseling and coaching parents, targeted parents from all over the world in English speaking, of course, because that's my only language I can speak. So I learn a lot from working with families and from targeted parents. And so today, what I'm going to share with you are the things I have learned over the years. And so I want to the 30 plus years of working as a forensic psychologist in various professional roles. So I've witnessed mental health and legal professionals knowing the arithmetic of abuse and neglect, but not the trigonometry of parental alienation. In other words, most professionals are trained in the field of neglect and abuse. And again, we've come a long way of just understanding child abuse. If you think of the Child Protective Services in terms of when that was established back in the, I don't know exactly, but it's only been decades. But they're very intuitive clinically when it comes to being able to pick up on child abuse and neglect. And they know the arithmetic of abuse and neglect, but trigonometry and parental alienation, and I call it trigonometry because it's more complicated. What you see and what you hear and what you get sometimes is not exactly what makes sense. And so we call it counterintuitive. And so a lot of professionals, when they're met with complex dynamics of parental alienation, the simple mathematic equation they learn in what I call estrangement school, because child abuse and neglect on a continuum, when I deal with resist and refuse dynamics as an evaluator, I'm evaluating, are these children resisting, refusing for estrangement dynamics, which is child abuse, neglect, domestic violence. Those children are rejecting a parent that's unfit. And on the other side of the spectrum is parental alienation, where children are rejecting an average range, sometimes more loving parent, often than the alienating parent. So they understand the math of abuse, but not the trigonometry. So they look at it as favored parent. This is the equation: favored parent minus rejected bad parent equals protected child. That's the math they do. But they don't know that they're actually doing bad math, which I say is alienating parent minus erasing, minus the average range loving parent, from it equals a psychologically abused child. That is the bad math. Alienating parent minus average range loving parent equals a psychologically abused child. You're not protecting these children when you're, supporting them being withdrawn from a loving average parent. So targeted parents don't even know what is happening sometimes until a mouse click quickens their enlightenment. And then after voracious learning, and this, you try to make sure that bad math isn't being done on you. And sometimes they find themselves desperately trying to teach professionals the trigonometry of parental alienation, hoping to find help from the professionals involved in their lives, in their children's lives. Now, I want to do a disclaimer before I get into the bulk of my presentation here. And the disclaimer is that I'm fully aware that the best prevention and intervention by targeted parents can never be enough to ultimately stop the insidious progression of parental alienation, particularly if they are working within a system of unwitting accomplices enabling the alienation. So even though I'm going to talk about mistakes that targeted parents make, and more focus today on the common dilemmas, I want to know that that there's not anything that a targeted parent can do in and of themselves to make the alienation go away. But there are some things to become aware of and mistakes not to make, and ways to present yourself to professionals that give you the most optimal chance to advocate for yourself and get the right people on your case. So a way to understand alienated children is to think of parental alienation as a type of psychological tumor that impacts the cognitive functioning in their brains and the emotional wiring to their hearts. It's invasive and will likely metastasize if ignored and untreated. The toxic attachment process with the alienating parent feeds the cancerous tumor, and as it grows, it riddles the minds of alienated children with false narratives and hearts that turn cold and hateful. Also, these children develop psychological problems, displaying irrational fears and toxic shame for rejecting parents that they actually love. Their psychic cage fighting, as I call it, is obscured by the shards of anger that cuts off relationships and shreds families. So we don't see behind all of that anger and rejecting behavior and hate, that inside them, they're psychically wrestling and struggling with all these intense emotions of shame and guilt and confusion, but they don't articulate that and tell you about that. All you see is the behavior. And as the professionals will also see behavior, and they'll hear false narratives as to what's happening, not the real narrative. So over the decades of toggling in and out of various forensic roles and playing witness to targeted parents' dilemmas, I've learned a thing or two, because I've seen a thing or two. You've seen the commercial from Farmers Insurance. So before I explain the common dilemmas, I want to quickly highlight the ones I did a while back, just touch on the 5 common mistakes, because that's going to put in context the dilemmas that targeted parents face can lead to mistakes. And so it's going to help us build empathy and understanding of how these mistakes happen. So while some can be quick to judge, I think that once people appreciate the dilemmas that targeted parents face, that our empathy can grow. And hopefully it will quicken our resolve as professionals to intervene, and for targeted parents to get the help they need. So the first of the 5 common mistakes is misunderstanding their children and personalizing the rejection. This emanates from naively assuming their children suddenly have turned into defiant and dishonest children from divorce stress, or the targeted parent over time just becomes exasperated and reacts maladaptively. A prolific example is when children are accused of lying. We've heard it over and over. They're just lying. I wish people would realize they're lying. It's not true. It's not true. But when we understand parental alienation dynamics in the psychological sequelae, as we call it, what follows from the PA parental alienation that we see is that the children are trying to cope with the parental alienation. And I don't think it's fair to say that they're lying. And if we understand what's really going on, I think we should change it to calling it confabulations. In confabulations and parental alienation are the generation of untruths and false memories without the intention of deception, but to cope with the psychological abuse. We tend to use in the psychological field confabulations for people who have traumatic head injuries or some type of amnesia, and they have memory deficits or they having trouble cognitively. And so they start manufacturing or confabulating, they say, about when they're asked questions about things as a way to protect themselves from feeling the shame and guilt of not having proper memory or cognitive functioning. And the intention for them is to not lie, but it is to avoid feeling the shame and guilt and trying to compensate. And I think that's what's happening with children in parental alienation. They don't have the intention of deceiving, but they're coping with the psychological abuse. And so they're adopting these false narratives and untruths. And we will call them confabulations rather than lying. So when targeted parents can differentiate themselves from their children's behavior intended to target them, they more readily approach their children with compassion. The second common mistake is believing that increasing punishment will put an end to bad behaviors and attitudes. And as alienated children become more defiant, disrupted, often parental intuition is to increase discipline, to encourage civility and compliance. That's what we do as parents, is that we want our kids to be civil and compliant, respectful, and we use various discipline strategies to get that child conditioned into being a healthy adolescent someday and a healthy adult and functional in the workplace, faith communities, and just in general in the community. I remember the mom who had it with her defiant adolescent. So she dropped her off on the side of the road and made her walk because this child was constantly during exchanges, and there was two other siblings. This child was the oldest, just raising Cain in the car, and the mom was trying to deal with the child, sometimes turning up the radio, sometimes trying to speak to her. And the younger kids over time began crying and upset. And so this mom, out of frustration, just dropped her off. And then over time, then the mom was seen as this bad person who dropped her kid off on the side of the road, and CPS got involved, and she just didn't have the proper support. Or I remember the dad who sequestered an aggressive adolescent to his bedroom for extended periods with locks on the outside while offering food, along with opportunities for restoration. And again, this is not something the father came to just in one incident. This is many times of having parenting time with this adolescent who was raising Cain and causing chaos in the family and taking food without asking and storing food in the house and causing aunts to come in, and just defiance. And this dad, finally, to protect the siblings and other people, he decided to come up with locking the child in the bedroom. And of course, you can see how that gets weaponized to make the dad look like he's an abusive, neglectful parent. So the metrics of making sure the punishment fits the crime or disciplining with love and logic are often lost in the escalation of punitive discipline. Unfortunately, as I said, this can play right into the false narrative of abuse and neglect. The third common mistake is to enlist or allow family and friends to lecture the children. Understandably, this comes from wanting to make a difference, as well as family and friends bearing witness to the rise of the children's hardened uncivility. Maybe the children will listen to grandma or heed the advice of Uncle Steve. Yes, the village does raise children, but if the children experience the parents' village as a hostile rival tribe, then it contributes to the tribal warfare often inherent in parental alienation. The fourth common mistake is to begin retaliating toward the alienating parent. While yearning for vindication, acts of retaliation can be used by sly alienators to buttress their false narrative. Also, alienated children will use said actions to justify their alliance to alienating parents. Feeling frustrated and ignored, parents may leave an electronic trail of snarky admonitions and combative responses. The parenting coordinator testifies that the targeted parent cussed out the alienating parent and stormed out of the session. The targeted parent justifies withholding the alienating parent's court-ordered parenting time to make up for the lost parenting time from the previous month or two. While retaliatory actions may feel good, they rarely do good. The fifth and final common mistake is when targeted parents begin to present themselves as angry, argumentative, and obstinate to professionals. This can interfere with getting proper help, since most professionals, as I said, find parental alienation dynamics counterintuitive. Professionals will often scrutinize the rejected parents or targeted parents' attitude and behavior in their office to confirm what sometimes is their bias. That children's resist and refuse dynamics, which I call RRDs, must be caused by the rejected parental unfitness. And guess what? This mistake can play right into their bias, and the parents are misunderstood and seen as the problem. Again, bad math is done on them, and they don't understand the trigonometry. And so they come in angry, aggressive, and frustrated to professionals, and then those very people confirm their biases. So naive professionals make what we call the fundamental attribution error. They erroneously conclude that the targeted parent's attitude and behavior are the cause of the reject and refuse dynamics in the children rather than the result. So they, again, do the bad math. And once that estrangement box or that equation gets constructed, it becomes very difficult for parents to sometimes to extricate themselves from that box. So now let's transition to dilemmas. A catch-22 or dilemma is a circumstance from which there is no escape. I boiled it down to 5 dilemmas targeted parents find themselves in. These parents begin searching for a way out of the dilemma by naively erring on one side of the dilemma or searching for that perfect balance somewhere from either polarized position. Once they discover what they think is a balance, which is elusive, a counter argument is suddenly thrown on the other side of the scale with the intention to never level set. The balance is specious, meaning that it looks like it could be true or might be possible, but it's designed to not be. That's what we call specious or spurious. It ushers in confusion and a feeling of powerlessness. This creates a state of desperation, which then becomes fertile ground sometimes for common mistakes to grow. So the first one is the dilemma of overparenting versus underparenting. This is criticism for being either too controlling, too intrusive, too abusive, or being characterized as on the underside of underparenting as uncaring, aloof, and neglectful. For example, attending the soccer games upsets the child. And if you cared and weren't so selfish, you wouldn't show up. Just give the child some time. You don't need to come in there and be so intrusive. Just don't come for a while and give the child some time. Let them have fun without your presence. So you concede to stop going temporarily. Then you unknowingly establish a fact pattern that is weaponized to prove you are disinterested in your child, maybe just too busy pursuing selfish interests. Instead of going to your soccer game afterwards, maybe you went and played a game of golf, and that got documented somehow. Or they say that you're now invested in your stepchildren's lives, and you went to your stepdaughter's soccer game or softball game instead because you were freed up, and that got documented or exploited. So again, it gets played out in various ways. I saw it play out once when I recently evaluated a family where a 12-year-old spent the entire weekend in her bedroom. She came with a backpack of supplies and only came out to use the bathroom. When the father knocked on the door and invited her to do an activity, it was deemed intrusive, a form of harassment. He was trying to coerce her to do something she didn't want. Just leave her alone and she'll come out of the bedroom in due time. So he did. He left her alone with that advice. And then he was characterized later as a father content to hold his daughter hostage for the weekend. If he didn't require her to comply with the court-ordered parenting time, he was afraid accommodation would produce the outcome of his adult children, which was they refused contact with their father, any contact, as of this day. Other dilemmas can be take away a child's electronics for not following the rules. They're ubiquitous, right? All these electronics, handhelds to laptops to Chromebooks, you name it. And then you're accused of isolating your child and interfering with his relationships during your parenting time. You're controlling, you're intrusive. You don't give the child reasonable access. Another example is you're accused of abuse when you take your assaultive teenager to the ground and administer a therapeutic hold. In a later incident, you follow the advice of a counselor, and then you are asked by the alienating parent and others, what kind of parent calls the police on his own child? So again, I've had a number of cases where there's been aggressive child. The parent tries to take matters in their own hands and maybe does a therapeutic hold, which could be taught to just prevent the child from hurting themselves and others and get some kind of contract to not be violent. And then that is portrayed as being aggressive and intrusive to the child. And so then the parent then says, well, I'll just call the police because they're breaking things in my house and they're assaulting me and their siblings. And then the police come to try to get some kind of peace. And that police report is then used against the parent. So those dilemmas increase frustration. And without coaching, I often see these parents, again, out of that frustration, are more likely to commit the common mistakes. So now let's move on to the second dilemma. And that is targeted parents getting tangled up in vacillating from what we call cooperative to parallel co-parenting paradigms. And again, we teach this in parenting coordination, that in high conflict families, we try to teach them to do parallel co-parenting, where there's not a lot of communication, decisions made on the fly, but following rules, creating structure that you follow those rather than having to make decisions on the fly and communicate a lot on phone and emails or texts. And then a cooperative co-parenting is the opposite, which is done by a lot of parents who are, don't even have a litigious divorce, and they end up not, the court-ordered parenting time says they will work out the parenting time together. There's not even anything written, and they just kind of do things on the fly. They're good business partnerships, raising children, and they put their romantic resentments aside. And that's called a cooperative co-parenting paradigm. So in this dilemma, if targeted parents pursue the parallel model to reduce conflict and establish boundaries, then the alienating parent seduces others into believing they just want to be cooperative, less rigid for the best interest of the children. So again, following this specious argument, targeted parents begin allowing communications to the alienating parent. This results in the children becoming defiant, or they spend more time isolated in their rooms in this effort to be more cooperative and laissez-faire. And then if the parents resort back to limiting communications, they are accused of interfering with the children's relationship with the alienating parent, or worse, reported to the police for obstructing communications and taking electronic devices away. So in the spirit of cooperation, sometimes targeted parents may openly share with children and co-parents their plans for their custodial weekend or extended parenting time. When doing so, plans are then sabotaged with competing activities, requests for changes, or botched exchanges. Parents are left in the catch-22 of either being criticized for being withholding and secretive with their plans to preserve their custodial time, or they experience increased resist or refuse dynamics when attempting to be more open. They often experience no way out of this dilemma. The third dilemma is whether the targeted parent addresses the escalating alienation dynamic in what we call a conciliatory versus litigious fashion. Either approach has consequences and can get weaponized or misunderstood. They are seen as litigious and controlling, or they're at risk of colluding with the alienation dynamic and letting it and fostering it and letting it grow. The sinister goal for alienating parents is to take advantage of targeted parents' conciliation while alternately implicating that motions to the court by the targeted parent are proof of their litigious character. So again, they're stuck in this double bind. One of the most damning seductions into conciliation is when targeted parents are talked into what we call, or I've heard, a cooling off period, a period of either limiting parenting time or none. A case seared in my memory is the father who agreed to a guardian ad litem's suggestion for a 12-week hiatus in parenting time. The father was to reinitiate contact with the children when they began reunification counseling with me 12 weeks later. So the 12, 10, and 8-year-old children filed into my office in chronological order, ignoring their father's warm and excitable greeting on that day. They proceeded to crunch together on my couch. They stared at their tightly folded hands while ignoring any of their father's questions or observations. Willing to engage with me in prior sessions, only the oldest child spoke to me, giving short, muffled answers. She eventually made repeated requests to end the session. After many failed attempts to engage them, I eventually delivered the children to their mother, the alienating parent, in the waiting room. When I returned to my office, I found the dad pacing with his hands cupping his head. I approached him and called out his name. He dropped to his knees, rocking and weeping in anguish from noticing how emotionally dead his children had become to him during the hiatus. What literally floored him is what we now know. Time is the enemy in parental alienation. The cooling off period only allowed their hearts to become colder from the psychological tumor being fed by immersive time with the alienating parent. It doesn't really work. So the conciliation of just take time and don't pursue parenting time ends up oftentimes making matters worse in certain cases. In other cases, I've coached targeted parents to respond adaptively and resiliently to their alienated children, and the counselor's working with the family, but the progression of parental alienation happens nonetheless. Some of these parents eventually choose and can financially afford the pathway of forensic evaluations and litigation while hoping for justice. Others can't afford it or end up paying for an unjust outcome. The dilemma of conciliation versus litigation is real for parents with no real certainty of outcomes. The fourth dilemma is actively challenging versus naively colluding with a false narrative. Remember, children are coping with psychological abuse. They reduce their shame and guilt for rejecting and professing hatred toward a loving parent or grandparent by clinging to what we call an encapsulated delusional system, which is a fixed and false narrative with a set of beliefs that are not true or distortions of the truth. When targeted parents challenge this delusion with truth, the children's shame and guilt can spike, and they run the risk of becoming emotionally and behaviorally dysregulated when they have what we call a shame attack. And then to not challenge that for fear of upsetting your children, parents risk colluding in silence, and then the psychological tumor grows and increasingly impacts the children's orientation to reality. So I've seen desperate parents provide corrective audio-visual evidence to counselors and courts regarding false allegations and then be accused of being creepy and intrusive. So to actively engage the narrative and risk shaming your child or being seen as a creep is quite the catch-22. Now, the fifth and the final dilemma is whether a targeted parent chooses to remain emotionally vulnerable to seek relationships versus invulnerable and defensive for self-protection. Many of you may have heard or have seen Dr. Brené Brown, a social scientist and author. She's published a lot of books and got a wonderful TED Talks. And She tells us some things that is really good about relationships. She encourages us to be emotionally courageous in our relationships and reminds us that what we fear often, being rejected and lonely, is what we often block with our defensiveness and insularity. I've seen open-hearted parents take her advice very seriously and come to life with love and hope and joy during extended parenting time with their children. Very open-hearted and non-defensive parents. Then a week later, their hearts are broken when children return from the alienating parent's custody. It's crushing for them to see the radiant love in their children's eyes turn dark and vacuous, and the joyous sounds of their voices blue and hateful. I've heard alienating parents and children complain that parents are cold, dispassionate about their children's needs and lives. Again, the demeanor in targeted parents is blamed for the growing gulf in the parent-child relationship rather than attributing their demeanor to the stressful alienation dynamic. Some beleaguered parents have asked me to give them permission to leave their children. While I never tell them what to do, I help them with this excruciating cost-benefit analysis. I don't know if I've ever facilitated a more grueling process than when parents say goodbye to their own children. The tears of grief and agony cascade down their cheeks and wet the pages of the final words to their children, with riveting reflections, benedictions, and even invitations to celebrate them home, as though they are hurriedly trying to write the happy ending of their own prodigal child story. And then these parents are often plagued by wondering what others think of them, especially when the brazen ones in the village ask the unnerving question, so what happened to your children? What happened to your grandchildren? While they tend to explain the trigonometry of PA or parental alienation to these people, they often, like the trained professionals who perform bad math, think you must be an unfit parent or unfit grandparent, since we know children don't reject good parents or good grandparents, do they? Yeah, they do. It's called parental alienation. In the end, what can be more painful than having a physically alive child emotionally and spiritually dead to you while others assume you buried them alive? So in conclusion, not only do professionals need to understand the counterintuitive dynamics of parental alienation and targeted parents as well, and other useful constructs, such as the 5-factor model, the 8 behavioral manifestations in children, the 17 parental alienating behaviors. There's a lot of literature out there and a lot of things that forensic evaluators like myself use, but I think it would be helpful for people to better appreciate the 5 common dilemmas targeted parents face or be at risk of committing a fundamental attribution error when they go about assessing the 5 common mistakes and assuming the mistakes are indicative of bad parenting or unfit parenting rather than being able to appreciate the amount of stress that these parents are facing and the dilemmas that they face. So this means having a greater appreciation for the deceptive, turbulent forces of alienation, the riptides that carry them out to sea away from the shores of parenting their children. I personally aspire to throw targeted parents a lifeline and teach them adaptive skills and build their resiliency. I love coaching and working with targeted parents and helping them with understanding what's going on. We do that for parents with special needs children, kids who have, autistic spectrum, ADHD, other kinds of learning disorders. We have lots of support group and ways of helping parents deal with these special needs. But with targeted parents, sadly, they're often ignored or worse, misunderstood or seen as monsters. So I hope to work with professionals also who can accurately identify the riptide of alienation. And in doing so, we are in a much better position to know the scope and severity while appropriating the best ways to intervene and intervene quickly. Because again, time is the enemy in alienation, and early intervention is going to be the most effective before it grows from mild to severe cases. So we can and we must work with others to prevent the loss of these vital relationships. May it be so. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Edward Crook, and I'm pleased to be the keynote speaker for the 2023 Family Access International Conference under the theme Alienation, the Truth Behind the Trauma and Abuse of alienation. And the title of my presentation, which is The Trauma of Parental Alienation as a Form of Family Violence and Child Abuse, is directly in line with the theme of the conference. And I'm very happy about that, because at the center of both my practice as a social worker and also as a family mediator, and at the core of my teaching and my research over the last 30 years or so, which has been all in the realm of children and families, is a focus on attachment and loss. I've really been honed in on the experiences of parents and children who are forcibly separated from each other. And I've always adopted from the beginning, over the last 30 years, it's always been at the center of my practice, is a trauma-informed approach. The interventions that I utilize in practice and the practices that I teach in social work and family mediation are very much trauma-informed. What is unique about parental alienation? That it's a kind of a unique form of trauma, a unique form of complex trauma on many levels. First of all, it affects both targeted parents and their children in parallel, and practitioners in the field are really challenged in regard to intervention that is directed at both child and parent. Secondly, it's an unresolved form of trauma and of abuse. It's ongoing. It remains unresolved. I noted that from the beginning of my research with traumatized parents and their children. It seems to never, that there's a full-scale grieving process, a full-scale trauma going on, but it's ongoing and it's never really resolved in many cases. People get stuck at different sort of points of the bereavement and attachment and loss continuum, and thus it presents challenges. It's an immediate kind of urgent crisis for people. It doesn't seem to get better with time, the trauma. Thirdly, it's both a form of individual abuse and collective abuse. That really makes it very complex and requiring a multifaceted approach, not just at the individual level, but at the sort of systems level. There's both an individual perpetrator involved in the abuse, but it's also a collective form of abuse in which social institutions such as the legal system, the child welfare system, the courts, it's both individual and collective abuse, in that it seems that we're working with a system that's invested in maintaining the status quo and doesn't really deal with parental alienation all that effectively. Now, what you'll get from me in my presentation will be, I guess, a more radical view of reform that's necessary. I'm going to focus also on diagnosis and assessment of parental alienation. It's really not that hard to diagnose violence and abuse and trauma and alienation. So why do we keep getting stuck in that regard? I'm really going to kind of focus on a practical approach to the reduction of harm and elimination of parental alienation. But my focus is mainly going to be on systemic change and the need for that, and how everyone has a responsibility toward addressing the alienation. It seems that the system, so-called the system that so many parents talk about, seems almost tailor-made to not only perpetuate parental alienation, but to create it, to cause it, in that it polarizes parents. There's sometimes potential for healing and reconciliation in the sense of not kind of cutting someone out of the picture in a child's life. This primal wound that is parental alienation can be prevented through systemic reform, removing those who profit from the adversarial system just right out of the picture. At the very least, you'll find my perspective to be thought-provoking, and the ideas that it stimulates will challenge these so-called received ideas, ideas that you've received over the years. And I'm looking forward to challenges, questions, debate, discussion, whether you're a parent, a politician, a policymaker, or a family practitioner in the legal or mental health fields. We all have a role to play in ameliorating, reducing harms, ameliorating alienation, and eliminating alienation. We're all responsible. I look forward to the conference, and thank you for your time today.
Next week on Families Divided TV, Dr. Edward Crook will speak to us on refuting arguments against parental alienation as a form of child abuse.